And given the time constraints, I'm probably going to have to race through this quickly. Doug always has too many slides, but I'm going to leave it to you to read the cautionary for yourselves later on. Again, this is just a summary slide we prepare at the beginning. I'm going to talk about these points as we go through, so I'm not going to try and dwell on them here at this point in time. The initial slides, many of you have seen these before. This is a 3D depiction of Pebble. The red zone is fundamentally Pebble West. The gray zone is Pebble East. The geometry and grade distribution of this project offer a lot of opportunity in different methodologies to mine this project: open pit, underground, bulk underground panel or block cave. And it's a continuous ore body, and it's open in 3 directions. The size and scale of the resource, again, many of you have seen this slide before. I don't plan to spend any time on it. The thing I like the best about the slide is actually the picture of what the Pebble project looks like. It's not what most people view of Alaska. This area is very flat. There isn't a tree in the valley that contains the Pebble deposit. Some low shrub growth and shattered rock. Again, we're the 9th largest copper deposit by resources, the 1st largest gold deposit by resources, but in both categories we're the largest undeveloped in the world, so it is the kind of project that almost any mining company in the world would envy owning a piece of. So last year we started the year off with 3 objectives: settle the EPA litigation, allow us to go into normalized permitting, repartner, and enter permitting. And we were successful on all fronts. In May, we settled with the EPA litigation, and that allowed us access unfettered to a normalized NEPA process managed by the Army Corps of Engineers with the other agencies as sub-agents to the Army Corps of Engineers. And that really drove the next 2 initiatives, which was it opened the door for the major mining companies who we were looking to partner with to look at Pebble in a typical permitting process. And after an extensive period, we entered into a framework agreement with First Quantum, announced that in mid-December. And based on all the work that we'd been doing over the prior 2 years, including keeping the agencies in Alaska up to date and reviewing that development and permitting plan with the various major mining companies, to file our permit applications on December 22nd, just before Christmas. So what is it that we're attempting to do? We're looking to permit a mine that has a 20-year mine life, and one that has a substantially smaller footprint than what was originally envisioned by the Bristol Bay Watershed Assessment, or potentially envisioned even ourselves and our former partners. Something that took cognizance or recognition of what the region and the state were saying to us in terms of lower your impact until you've established your operating credentials. And so we took a hard look at that and said, what can we do? Well, a number of other things. Because of the geometry of the deposit, we could focus on Pebble West, which kept us in 1 watershed instead of 2. We could focus on Pebble West, where the waste-ore ratio was extremely low, and therefore have no waste deposit site, again reducing the footprint. Most of the waste rock will go to the ballast on the tailings impoundment structure. So net of all of that, we end up with a footprint of about 5.6, 5.8 square miles, and a throughput, which is what everybody's looking for, of about 160,000 tons a day, and a mine that will be mining 1.1 billion tons over the first 20 years of mine life. Waste to ore ratio of 0.1 to 1, almost an unheard of. A 2 to 1 waste to ore ratio would probably deliver ore to the mill at $6 per ton. Ours will be about $2.20 at the same $2 per ton of mine operating costs. The annual production, you can see there, 600,000 tons of copper concentrate containing a high quality gold component, very, very clean concentrates, no deleterious items, no penalties. So about 287 million pounds of copper and 321,000 ounces of gold. We talk about it, it's a smaller mine, much smaller footprint than originally envisioned, but still at 160,000 tons a day and that kind of production, it's not truly a small mine. In addition, there's 15 million tons of molybdenum concentrate, 13 million pounds of moly. That moly concentrate will have a very high rhenium content. Infrastructure-wise, about an 83-mile road, ferry, and road to a port on Cook Inlet near the Pacific Ocean, and a 230 megawatt power plant at site with a pipeline from Nikiski down the Kenai Peninsula, a submerged pipeline across Cook Inlet, and then onto the transportation corridor. So here we've got basically what the footprint looks like. You can see in here that there's no permanent waste site. Tailings, that site has capacity for in excess of 2 billion tons. This will be about 1 billion tons of tails. Between 10 and 15% is PAG. I do understand that there was some questions about, is this all acid generating rock? Absolutely not. By far and away, the majority of it is non-acid generating rock. The PAG, the potentially acid generating rock, will be sequestered in a lined facility, and so will be dealt with separately. And we've also decided not to undertake a cyanide in the processing. So there's about 10 to 12% of the gold that would report to a gold plant that used cyanide. There are other mines in Alaska that are 100% cyanide based, but again, it was decided to improve the probability of getting a permit. Let's leave the cyanide off for now. We'll revisit that at some future date. A tremendous amount of work is being done on lixiviants, that is the chemicals that are used to win the gold out of pyritic rock, and maybe at some future date it's not even cyanide. Also, people asked us about the ferry across the lake. Well, the alternative is to go around the lake either end, either go west and south or go due east. This going across the lake reduces the footprint on wetlands tremendously. Again, we're talking about a smaller footprint mine, and 5.6, 5.8 square miles is truly a small footprint. Permitting, and how is this going to go? Well, we've always understood that in the permitting process, a normalized permitting process, it's managed by the Army Corps of Engineers. The Army Corps of Engineers has an obligation to find LEDPA, the least environmentally damaging practical alternative under which to grant you a permit. It's definitely positively inclined towards the issuance of a permit. And there are also, within the regulations, guidelines on the time it takes for the various aspects of the process. For instance, public consultation are usually mandated for 30 days, but we've watched those grow over the last decade or more to many times they're 180 or even over 200 days. We believe that it's very realistic within the guidelines that have been established by NEPA to see us complete the draft EIS by mid-year next year, and potentially even the record of decision before mid-2020 or late 2020. The key, though, is to get to the EIS. The EIS is the critical document in the NEPA processing. All the agencies, leading with the Army Corps of Engineers, have to base their decision on that EIS. And because the EIS is fundamentally our environmental baseline document, $150 million worth of studies on 400 square miles around the property of the environment as it stands unaffected, and you lay on top of that our project description, which we filed with the Army Corps of Engineers on December 22nd, you take one on top of the other, you determine what the footprint is on the EBD and what the impacts of that is, on things like water flows, water quality, and the rest of those kinds of things. We've obviously done much of that ourselves, and we've determined what the mitigation will be, what the outcomes will be, and we believe that'll simply be confirmed by the independent engineer. So on December 22nd, we filed, and on January the 5th, the Army Corps of Engineers receipted us I mean, this was very unusual, unique for a large-scale industrial complex in the United States. It's been decades since an initial application has been reseeded upon its first pass. And so I think, that speaks a couple of things. Number one, it speaks to the size and the scale of the database we've got. It's extremely comprehensive, and that's what you get for spending $750 million on a project. Thank you very much, Anglo American and Rio Tinto. Second of all, it was a comprehensive team that put all of this together. We've assembled a team, there's a slide on that here, who are well skilled in permitting. Tom Collier, the CEO of Pebble Limited Partnership, has a 20-year track record in permitting large-scale projects in Alaska, albeit they're in the oil and gas industry, but permitting is permitting, and he knows and understands what he's doing. And then the rest of the team that's there, including James Foog, who led the Donlin process in their permitting process. So we've been reseated. The RFPs for the independent engineering company to do the EIS have been issued. We believe that decision should come around the end of this month. And subsequent to that will be the independent engineer working with the Army Corps of Engineers to prepare the scoping study. And the scoping study, we believe, can be done in roughly 90 days. It goes out for a 30-day commentary period. Once that scoping study is completed, we, Northern Dynasty, will complete a PEA and file that publicly on what is contained within that scoping study so that people will have an understanding of the economics of the project as opposed to just its physical characteristics, which you see now. And then we think it's very realistic that the independent engineering company completes that EIS by roughly mid-year, third quarter of next year, which would give, in the current administration, a full year to complete public review and a decision. Our objective is to create a mine that delivers value to shareholders and stakeholders. It's a game changer for the region. I'll give you some ideas about this, but we're committed to earning our social license, earning our capabilities, our operating credibility with the region, and moving this region ahead. I mean, employment is almost non-existent in the area, full-time employment. The commercial fishery, while it's one of the greatest ones in the world, runs roughly 3 months a year. And in the region of Pebble, what we call the Lakes region, there's not really any involvement from the commercial fishery. So we think that this opportunity presents itself for game changer in terms of employment, tax base, and electrification of the region. So part of that is what we call repositioning the project. And this is one of the keys for, I think, why we chose First Quantum, is because the executives there, they said, well, Ron, all of this stuff that you've talked about it generally in past, but people are treating it like platitudes. Until you actually can put it into writing, present it as part of a permitting process so that people really have a feeling that you're committed to it, they're going to treat it like platitudes. And so that's why it was so important to get into permitting, so now people can see, well, what is it that we're talking about, what we're wrapping around this in terms of the opportunities. And we're looking at developing a vehicle that will hold an economic interest in Pebble, and that vehicle will be owned by the people in the region. We haven't decided exactly what that vehicle is yet. We want to talk to the different stakeholders, the native corporations, both the regional and the village corporations. Should it be held through one or more of those? Should it be a separate entity, a separate vehicle? And in Alaska, the natives are very familiar with this kind of development because that's how native land claim settlements were created under ANCSA in 1970. Also, the transportation corridor will provide infrastructure for an area that has no roads and no real infrastructure. You know, a half gallon of milk costs $11. Well, with this infrastructure in place, the costs of living will come down substantially. In addition, we'll cross native lands and we'll pay tolls for those. We want to enter into certain strategic relationships with the commercial fisheries. We've got an initiative around providing a base of per pound of fish for Alaskan licensed commercial fishermen. We also want to provide a low-cost electrical power, take it from 60 to 80 cents a kilowatt hour down to 8 to 10 cents a kilowatt hour for processing and for ice production, so that we can improve the value of that fishery, increase the margins for fishermen. And so we think through all of that, people will see the opportunity that Pebble creates. The Lake and Penn Borough, which is the taxing jurisdiction that we're in, it's roughly 1,800 people live in that borough, and their tax base is currently about $3.5 million. Pebble in production, the scale that we're looking at is probably going to generate a property tax, or they call it a severance tax, of $18 to $22 million a year. Well, that's the equivalent of $1,000 per every man, woman, and child in the borough. Can you imagine the value of that in terms of education, medical, and other facilities for the region? So, First Quantum, I mean, first of all, the transaction itself can be looked at in two different ways. From my standpoint, from Northern Dynasties, it's simply a replacement of the Anglo deal. It's $1.5 billion that they have to commit ultimately to own 50% of this project, all or none. If they don't do the entire $1.5 billion, they've earned nothing. First Quantum, the way they look at it is there's two components. There's the option component and then the exercise component. They bought an option for $150 million paid over 4 installments, one of which has already been made, to control the opportunity to own 50% of Pebble. To exercise the option, they then have to commit $1.35 billion, the remainder of the $1.5 billion, to the capital of the project to develop the mine. And so they aren't committed to the $1.35 billion today. That will come at some future date when the record of decision is made. So from their standpoint, they've effectively taken an exploration per year type of budget, $37.5 million, and given that to us to purchase the option. That money is actually going into the asset in terms of that's what's going to pay for the permitting process, and they'll be able to look at all of the things that are questions in people's minds. Obviously, the region, what's in it for the region, the fisheries, the environmental, and the economics over this 3 to 4 years of permitting, after which they will make a decision on whether or not they commit the $1.35 billion. So First Quantum's priority today is Cobre de Panama. We understand that fully. They've got to get it up and operational. They're probably 70-80% complete, so they got a bit more work. It's going to come into production the second half of this year, and they also have to convert construction loans to long-term project non-recourse loans, which is an immediate priority. This fulfills all of that. It allows them to focus on Cobre de Panama. It allows us to focus on permitting. And at the end of the day, they assessed that our permitting team was the kind of team that was needed to permit this project, and we believe they're the ideal candidate to build this mine. I mean, First Quantum, while it may not be a household name in North America, is considered the preeminent mine builder in the world today. I mean, they've just come off successfully Kinshasa, Sentinel, and now they're into Cobre de Panama. And I won't get into all the details on it, but I mean, basically, Norm Keevel's book, Don't Rest on Your Oars, has a great page on the history of mining companies and when they were at their epigee, when they were great. You know, Placer Dome, Teck, Noranda, and it was when they were building a series of mines, and it's like, you know, practice makes perfect. The more you build, the better your team gets, and so you ultimately become this expert mine builder, and that's where First Quantum, I think, is today, and that's the feedback we've gotten from all of the institutional people that we've met with. Here's a slide on where they operate. They do operate around the world, Southern Africa, Zambia, Turkey, Scandinavia, Australia, and now Panama, and they really are looking for something more in the Americas, especially North America. The Pebble Partnership team, the permitting team led by Tom Collier. He's got a long record in project permitting. He's a lawyer by profession, and people say, well, how do you have a lawyer as a CEO? Well, the reality is getting a permit's more about understanding the legal nature and the bureaucracy of permitting. We don't need a mining engineer, we don't need a geologist to get a permit. We need a guy who's very knowledgeable about regulatory process and administrative procedure. And Tom's there to get the permit, and once he's got the permit in hand, then First Quantum will be appointing a new CEO. John Shively's got a long history in Alaska. He was the chief commercial officer for Nana Corporation, a native corporation, when they did the deal with Red Dog, or with Cominco, to build the Red Dog mine. Mark Hamilton, who's just recently joined us, long distinguished career in the military, retired to Alaska, became the president of Alaska for a little over a decade. He's one of the preeminent opinion leaders in Alaska. The value proposition. And this is a slide I find sometimes embarrassing because of where we sit. I mean, on a copper equivalent basis, and this includes our, we're at basically a half a cent per pound, and doesn't include the inferred resource, just the measured and indicated. And where we should be is at least 1.6 cents a pound. On a gold-only basis, we're trading at $8 an ounce, and we should be trading at $42 an ounce. If these assets were owned by a major mining company, you can see where they would be trading at. I mean, one of the things people ask me about valuations, and I mean, I say, you know, look by example. First Quantum paid $5.1 billion for Inmet in 2012. And while it had a couple of other small mines and some cash in it, by far and away the bulk of that money went towards the purchase of a project in Panama, Cobre de Panama, which shares many of the features of Alaska. It's remote. It needs infrastructure, road, port, and power. Their reserves and resources are about 25-30% of what Pebble's are, and their grade is less than what Pebble's are. So I mean, even on the economics, I think Cobre de Panama presents an excellent analogy. So our milestones for this year, key milestones, is the initiation, which is really the appointment of the independent engineer who's going to run the EIS. We expect that in the next 2 to 4 weeks, and for that engineer then to complete a scoping study, which will come into the public domain so that we can file our PEA shortly thereafter. So that should happen 2 to 4 weeks, the appointment, probably 90 days to get the scoping study done, and we file a PEA sometime mid-Q2 to late Q2. Also, when we signed the agreement and announced it with First Quantum, we signed a very substantive framework agreement which laid out all the salient issues and covered a lot of the things that are ultimately in the comprehensive option agreement. This has allowed First Quantum to spend the time that they need to complete their project resource, non-recourse financing on Cobre de Panama, and then they can turn back to the completion of the option agreement, which we expect to be done early in Q2. Once the scoping study, public commentary is completed, that will initiate probably around Q3, I would suggest, the EIS process by the independent engineer, and should lead to, we believe, a draft EIS mid to third quarter of 2019. And then throughout the year, we will be advancing and contracting all of those repositioning items that I talked about a little bit earlier, which we think are going to be key to changing a lot of the mines and the positions of Pebble in the region and in the state. In terms, this is just a slide on our market capitalization. I mean, a lot of people ask me, okay, Ron, what happened to the stock? You announced repartnering, you announced permitting, and the stock went down. Well, the reality was that in the pre-market trading, on the day that we announced the First Quantum deal, the stock actually went up to 260, 270 in the pre-market, and then on the opening, it came off. I mean, one of the things about the short and distort market, the hedge funds that specialize in shorting, is there are certain metrics that they operate on, not necessarily anything to do with the reality of the deposit. They're looking for a company that has a very large retail shareholder base, because retail shareholders tend to hold their accounts, their stock at brokerage firms in margin accounts, and that stock can easily be loaned out to cover the short sellers. So there's a tremendous amount of stock available that they can borrow. And second of all is they're looking for price volatility, which Pebble has demonstrated over the last period of time. Again, a lot of it to do with social media and stories and rumors that run up and down. And I mean, we obviously get a lot of questions about social media. There's a lot of commentary, and I tell people, listen, we do not talk to any of these people. We don't give them any insight, so don't think that they have any particular access or insight to the people you get your news just the same time as they get theirs. They may be then speculating on other things. So one of the objectives is to bring more institutional shareholders, decrease the volatility, and get rid of the short selling, we think, over time. The major institutions we're looking for us to reduce the risks that Pebble presented when we were in litigation with the EPA, and reduce the financial cost of the dilution. So we've done that. We've also demonstrated that we now have a financing vehicle in place to finance the $150 million for the permitting. That's the deal with First Quantum, and we've started the permitting process, and the first results of initiating that permitting process were very positive in that we got permitted in the first 15 days. So I think we're going to see a lot more on that front. And this is the slide I started with, so I'm going to conclude with it. It's a world-class resort. We're now into a very normalized permitting process. I think the aha moment, if you will be when the draft EIS is released by the Army Corps of Engineers mid-year to third quarter next year, and everybody sees that it's a vanilla. There's nothing unusual about it. There's no extraneous operating requirements. It's as normal as any other mining project anywhere in the world, and people will then realize, yes, they're going to get their permit, and the opportunity to control the other half of the world's greatest undeveloped project will come to the forefront of their mind. We think that over the next year we'll be able to work with interests in the region to demonstrate what a huge game changer Pebble presents to them. And then finally, this is the kind of project that is a generational opportunity. Yes, I know the NGOs say, oh, well, this is just the camel getting his tent in the nose. I don't know what they got against camels or tents, but they're saying they're trying to permit a small mine when really this mine, and for only 20 years, when this mine is going to go for many generations thereafter, and Ron even talks about it publicly. Well, I don't know too many mines that start off at a scale and don't change over time. I mean, one of the things is, today I can't stand up here and tell you, after 20 years, what will be the next mining method? Will it be open pit? Will it be underground? Will we want to expand the concentrator? Will we want to put a gold circuit in? So why would we attempt to permit something like that today when we couldn't answer the questions that the Army Corps of Engineers would be asking us about that? If we want to do those things, then we will have to permit those as and when we decide how we're going to go about it. So it's only natural we permit what we see in the foreseeable future as an operation. At 160,000 tons a day, the resource that we have actually could last 200 years. So I'll conclude with that. And if people have questions, very happy to answer.